Greetings, everyone. This is Paul from Paul's Passing Thoughts, going into part 2 here of Protestantism's law problem. Quick review here of part 1. Protestantism is not a justification or righteousness apart from the law, per Romans 3:21. Protestantism teaches that justification is defined by perfect law-keeping, and hence Jesus had to come and keep the law perfectly to qualify as a substitution for sin. Now, though we'll discuss this further along, it is our contention that Jesus was already qualified to be a propitiation for our sin based on who he was, okay? Not the fact that he came and earned that righteousness so that he would be an adequate sacrifice, and that supposedly his resurrection was proof that God was pleased that he had kept the law well enough. That's Protestantism, and that is just turns the scriptures upside down. But anyway, the goal here is to start out with this in small bites and take the simplest concepts one at a time and then build as we go. So here we go. So somehow Protestants think that justification is of the law because Jesus kept it perfectly. The issue is the law, period, not who keeps it or doesn't keep it. Okay? As we shall see in future parts, the law was not created to define justification to begin with. That is not why God brought the law to bear. So, next, in this part, let me see here, part 1 review, there we go. So today we're going to look at Romans 6:14, and that says, For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. So, and then that's the NIV, NLT. Sin is no longer your master, for you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace. As human beings walk the earth, they are, and you are, either under law or under grace, lost or saved, under condemnation or not under condemnation. You're one or the other, you can't be both. Okay? Clearly in Romans 6:14, Paul says that sin shall no longer be your master because you are not under law but under grace. And in these verses, notice the connection between sin and being under law. Okay? Synonymous with being under the law is sin being your master. So clearly in Protestantism, the so-called believer remains under law. Actually, rather than being under one or the other, Protestantism teaches that a so-called saved person is under both simultaneously. In essence, grace is a covering for remaining under the condemnation of the law. Okay? Now, we're not, as I said here, we're not going to presently address the problem of difference between the ending of sin or covering of sin or atonement. But we'll address that as we go along. But the true gospel, justification by new birth, is not a covering of sin, a mere covering of sin or an atonement, but it's an ending of sin, and we'll get to that later on in further parts. Okay, so Martin Luther's doctrinal tenet, and this is huge in Protestantism, is the whole, simultaneously saint and sinner thing, right? And the spiffy or formal Latin term that they like to throw around escapes me, but it boils down to simultaneously saint and sinner. This is exactly what the soteriological tenet states. So-called believers are simultaneously under law and under grace. The Apostle Paul said, no, you are one or the other. Okay? This is clearly at odds with Scripture. So you say, well, Paul, didn't Luther mean that saints or saved people sin sometimes? Isn't that what he was saying? No. And the soteriology of Protestantism bears this out in the way it functions and other teachings in no uncertain terms. Protestantism is, first of all, it's not apart from the law. And by the way, we're going to get into the question of, okay, Paul, so, righteousness is apart from the law, okay, or has no part with the law. So how do you define justification then? What is the foundation of justification if it's not the law? Well, we're going to talk about that. All right, we will get to that, and I'll give you a hint. It's all about the book of Galatians. Okay? And these guys like to throw around, a lot of times you'll hear them, talk about, this, that, and the other subject is the Galatian problem all over again. They love to throw that around like a cliche. It's the 1 Corinthians problem all over again. It's the Galatians problem all over again. Well, this is what I'm going to demonstrate unequivocally, that the Protestant soteriology or the Protestant gospel is the Galatian problem all over again to a T. And we're going to look at that. So, this is continuing on here. This is exactly, finding my place here, using the slide. This is exactly what the soteriological tenet states. So-called believers are simultaneously under law and under grace. This is clearly at odds with Scripture, as I noted earlier. So, Luther said this, right? Simultaneously saint and sinner. So what did Luther mean by that? Well, what I want to note now is that according to Scripture, the biblical definition of a sinner is somebody who is yet under law and yet enslaved to sin, and all the other definitions that fall from being under law. Scripture clarification on this. We can start, there's many, but we can start with John 9:31. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, But if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. So when you're getting into Luther's definition of what a saint is, we got a problem here. Technically, Scripture would say that the prayers of the saints are not heard. Okay? Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us in that while we were, past tense, still sinners, Christ died for us. All right? And then 1 Timothy 8-11. But we know that the law is good if a man uses it lawfully. All right? So what is it to use the law lawfully? Okay? We'll get into that. Okay? But if you interpret to using the law lawfully in regard to being both under law and under grace simultaneously, that's a problem. All right? Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man. You got that? All right? God didn't make the law for righteousness. God didn't make the law for a righteous man. So therefore, he didn't even make the law for Jesus' sake. Certainly we can say Jesus was a righteous man. But who the law is for, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane. See, when we get into these definitions, Protestantism poses just a huge problem when compared to Scripture. So, definition of a sinner. The biblical definition of a sinner is someone who is unsaved, under law, under sin, and under condemnation. So on this part, in conclusion, Martin Luther clearly defined a believer as someone under law and under grace simultaneously, in overt contradiction to Scripture. When a Christian fails to love, this falls under the chastisement of a loving Father, not the condemnation of the law. More on this as we developed this study. All right, again, we're just going to take small bites and focus on the basics going forward. All right, but the way I want to frame this right now is do the saints or a saved person, can their so-called sinning bring them back under condemnation? Well, Calvin and Luther both said yes. All right? And that's where you get into this continual reapplication with grace to the believer. Okay? And remember what Vodi Bachman said in our first part, we're sanctified by the same gospel that saved us. That's why he's saying that. Because in Protestantism, the so-called believer is under law and under grace simultaneously, and since the believer is still under the condemnation of the law, you gotta keep reapplying that grace. All right? And we're going to develop this as we go on, but all of this is just overt Protestantism, and if you listen carefully to what these men say, whether it's MacArthur or Vodi Bachman or John Piper or Steve Lawson, whoever it is, you will hear them say this, okay, in direct contradiction to Scripture. So there's a lot of Protestants out there, but unfortunately Most of them aren't paying attention. At any rate, when only considering Romans 3:21 and 6:14, we see that Protestantism represents an overt and stunning contradiction to the plain sense of Scriptures. It's a house of cards. Based on the very foundational tenets, Protestantism is just a house of cards, big time. So we're going to wrap up the second part, and I'll ponder what we want to develop next, and I'll see you in the third part. Thanks for tuning in and listening.